This person is going to lose themselves. They will spend the next 3 decades constructing a character with absurd precision, fine-tuning their tone of voice, shaping their facial expressions, looking like whatever others expect them to look like. But the ritual doesn't end when the character is finished. Years after the final adjustment, this person continues sustaining the work every single day, wearing it in the shower, in their sleep, in traffic. This person might be you, and the face in the mirror at night, when the noise of the day finally dies down, knows this before you're willing to admit it. There's exhaustion, of course, but there's also a question. Who is this person here when nobody needs them for anything? And at what exact moment, without you noticing, did the mask that promised to protect you become the very thing that's now suffocating you? I know this is hard to hear. Maybe you're listening to these words on your phone, lying down, after another day that felt just like the one before. Maybe you're thinking that this kind of stuff is for people who have nothing better to do. But if some part of you recognized what was just described, it's because some part of you already knows. You already know there's a distance between the person you show during the day and the person you are when nobody is watching. And that distance keeps growing. Carl Jung spent decades studying that distance. He realized that every human being, while growing up inside a society, has to construct a certain kind of mask. A version of themselves that's presentable, functional, accepted by others. Jung gave this a technical name, and the name wasn't chosen by accident. He used the Latin word persona, which was exactly what the actors of ancient theater called the mask they placed on their faces before stepping onto the stage. The Romans said persona because it was through that mask that the sound of the actor's voice traveled. It was through it that the character became visible to the audience. In his book, The Ego and the Unconscious, Jung described the persona as a compromise between what the individual is on the inside and what society expects them to be on the outside. It isn't, in itself, a bad thing. Quite the opposite. Without any mask at all, nobody would ever be able to leave the house. Nobody would be able to work, get along with others, form bonds, or maintain relationships. The persona serves a real function. It softens rough edges, translates internal complexity into something digestible, and makes it possible for people to coexist. The problem, according to Jung, isn't having a persona. The problem starts somewhere else, somewhere far more subtle, somewhere far more dangerous. The problem starts when that mask, which used to be just a piece of clothing we'd put on to step out into the world, stops being clothing and turns into skin. When we stop taking it off when we get home. When we wear it even in the shower, in our sleep, in the silence. When at some point we can never quite pinpoint, we stop knowing where it ends and where we begin. That's the point, Jung said, where the persona stops being a tool and becomes a prison. Where the mask stops serving the person, and the person starts serving the mask. And you didn't even notice. And it's important to stop here and think about how exactly this happened to you. Because nobody is born with a persona. Nobody comes out of the womb already knowing they need to hold back their tears, hide their fear, swallow their fragility, and keep their voice steady and firm. All of that was built layer by layer. Maybe the first brick was laid when you were 4 or 5 years old, when you fell on the ground crying, and somebody said that one phrase that sank in so deep it never left. Stop crying. Maybe it was when you were 7, when you got scared in the dark, and were told that fear was something only silly little kids felt. Maybe it was when you were 12, when you felt a sadness you couldn't explain and realized, all on your own, that nobody around you wanted to hear about it. That talking about it pushed people away instead of bringing them closer. And nobody asked. Each one of those small scenes, on its own, seems insignificant. But Jung realized that this is exactly how the persona forms. Not through one big trauma, but through thousands of silent micro-conditionings. The praise the child got for being strong, the indifference when they showed vulnerability, the social approval when they took on the expected role, the subtle punishment, sometimes nothing more than a look, when they stepped out of character. A child's brain learns quickly what's safe and what isn't. And what it learned, over decades of small corrections, was more or less this. Show strength and hide weakness. Anything that looked like vulnerability, pain, doubt, or exhaustion had to be pushed into some invisible corner. The character had to show up. The person didn't. The result is who you are today. Someone who learned their role so well that they often confuse the role with their identity. Someone who, if they're being honest with themselves right now, will admit that it's been a long time since they really cried, a long time since they said what they felt, without filtering every word in their head first, and that maybe they can't even remember the last time they let their face relax when walking into a room. The face goes in first. You come in behind it. And you know this. There's a painful detail in this whole process. A lot of the people carrying the most rigid personas weren't spoiled children. They were children who became responsible far too early. They were the ones who grew up hearing they needed to help out at home, to keep things together, to set an example for their younger sibling, to not be a burden, to not get in the way, to not weigh anyone down. They learned, even before they understood what they were learning, that the love they received was conditional love. They got approval when they functioned. They got silence when they didn't. And silence for a child is a very subtle form of abandonment, and it hurt. I know this conversation is hard. It makes complete sense that you'd recognize yourself here, because this isn't the story of one specific person. It's the silent story of an entire generation that grew up believing that feeling things was a luxury they couldn't afford. That child grew up believing, deep down, that they were only loved for what they delivered, that they had no value just for existing, that they had to produce results to deserve attention. And the adult that child became continues, decades later, repeating the same equation. They overwork themselves to finally be seen, and they carry responsibilities on their back that aren't theirs. Always like someone who needs to confirm, one more time, that they're holding up their end of the deal. The persona in this case isn't just a social mask, it's a strategy for emotional survival, learned before they ever learned to tie their shoes. Jung observed a specific phenomenon that might interest you. He noticed that people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s started showing up at his office with a similar complaint. They had achieved everything society told them they should achieve. Financial stability, a structured family, a respected name at work, a certain standard of living that served as an example to younger people. And yet, they still felt an emptiness they couldn't name, a diffuse sense that life was happening somewhere else, that they were carrying out functions, fulfilling roles, but that the main character of their own story was no longer them. It was the persona. This phenomenon has a very characteristic symptom. It's an exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix. You wake up tired even after 8 hours of sleep. You spend the entire Sunday resting and still start Monday feeling like you've already worked a full week. This exhaustion isn't physical, at least, not primarily. Jung would say it's psychic exhaustion. Maintaining a rigid persona, day after day, year after year, demands an enormous expenditure of internal energy. It's like holding a door shut with your body the entire time, never being allowed to let go. At first, you don't even notice. But after 20 or 30 years of doing this, the body simply starts handing you the bill. Have you ever noticed how many people seem genuinely surprised when their bodies start breaking down around 40? Their blood pressure starts rising without warning. The sleep that used to be deep is now broken up throughout the entire night, and some chronic pain shows up somewhere in the body that never used to hurt before. And they hear from their doctor that everything's fine, that it's stress, that it's just age, but it isn't only that. Jung had an observation that's worth gold in this context. For him, when an internal situation isn't brought to consciousness, it ends up happening in the external world, as if it were fate acting upon you. In other words, what you don't allow to show up in your mind as a thought, a feeling, or a word will show up in your body, in your life, in your relationships, in your biography. One way or another, it will show up. The psyche refuses to be silenced forever. Pay attention to the small clues in your daily life that would normally go unnoticed. The disproportionate irritation over something silly, like the driver in front of you taking 2 extra seconds at a green light. The heavy sigh that escapes when you sit down in your car after work, before turning on the engine. The prolonged silence during dinner, where you're physically present but mentally somewhere else. and you can't even pretend to be following the conversation anymore. These micro scenes, added up, tell a story that your packed schedule doesn't tell. They tell you that there's someone inside of you asking for permission to rest, and that permission never comes because the persona wasn't trained to grant it. It was trained to keep going. And here's a cruel detail. The better you are at maintaining the persona, the more convincing your character is, the harder it becomes for anyone around you to notice that something's wrong. You become someone nobody asks how they're doing, because you're always fine, always handling everything that gets dropped in your lap. The people around you start to count on it. They start to depend on it. And you, who maybe deep down would have liked someone to notice your exhaustion, discover that the success of your performance has created exactly the opposite. It's created a world where nobody sees you, because what everyone sees is the mask, and the mask never asked for help. Nobody noticed. That's maybe the quietest price of always being the strong one. You become invisible to the very people you love the most, not because they don't care, but because you taught them, over decades, that there was nothing to care about. You taught them so well that now you don't know how to undo it. And there's another price, less obvious, that very few people manage to name. It's the loss of the ability to feel pleasure. Not the loud kind, the kind that comes from consumption and public recognition. That one still works, even if it's getting weaker and weaker. I'm talking about silent pleasure, the pleasure of a morning with no schedule, where the coffee is sipped slowly, with nobody expecting anything from you. The pleasure of a conversation with an old friend who isn't asking for anything in return. Whoever lives identified with the persona slowly loses access to that kind of pleasure, not because it disappears, but because the mask is incapable of feeling it. Only you, underneath the mask, can. And that part of you, for a very long time, hasn't been given any space to show up. And while you're sustaining the persona out there, something is happening in here. Jung gave that other something a name too. He called it the shadow. And understanding the shadow changes the way you look at everything you feel. And in just a moment, I'm going to show you the concept that forever changed the way Jung saw the way out of this maze. But first, you need to understand something that might never have been explained to you in this way. Think about it like this. Every time the persona said no to something inside of you, that something didn't disappear. It just went somewhere else. The anger you weren't allowed to feel went somewhere. The sadness you couldn't show went somewhere. The fear you couldn't admit to went somewhere. The excessive tenderness, the inconvenient desire, the dream considered foolish, the talent that was called impractical, all of it went somewhere. That somewhere is what Jung called the shadow. It's the basement of the house of your mind. It's where everything lives that you had to hide so that the persona could keep functioning up above. And here's the uncomfortable point. The more perfect the persona, the denser the shadow. People who seem extremely balanced on the outside usually carry enormous shadows on the inside. Not because they're worse than anyone else, but because the amount of stuff they had to repress to maintain that appearance of balance was massive. And that shadow doesn't stay quiet forever. It leaks out. It leaks out in the disproportionate reactions to small things. It leaks out in the extra drink you have on a Friday night. It leaks out in road rage, and in that bitter comment thrown at someone you love, in a sudden explosion over some domestic detail that rationally wouldn't justify any of that. When that happens, you scare yourself. You think, I'm not like this. I don't recognize this in me. And that's exactly the point. It isn't the persona that's reacting. It's the shadow. It's everything you pushed down into the basement for years, forcing the door open to get out, even if just for a few seconds. Jung said the shadow is like a dam. You can ignore it. You can pretend it doesn't exist. But the water keeps rising, and eventually, it overflows. It always overflows. That's why he insisted on something that sounds counterintuitive. You don't get rid of the shadow by avoiding it. You get rid of it by looking at it, by acknowledging it, by integrating it. Everything that's denied grows. Everything that's faced loses power. And this is exactly where one of the most beautiful concepts in Jungian thought comes in: the self. If you're still here, following along up to this moment, Stay with me, because what comes next is the heart of everything. For Jung, the self isn't the ego. It isn't the persona. It isn't the shadow. The self is the authentic and total center of the psyche. It's something larger than any of the roles you play. Something that was inside you before the mask was ever built. That kept existing while the mask grew. And that continues to exist right now, in this exact second as you're listening to this. The self is, in simple words, who you really are. Not the child who needed to please their parents. Not the professional who needs to deliver results. Not the family figure who needs to set the example. Not the partner who needs to keep everything afloat. Underneath all of that, there is a you. And that you never went anywhere. What happens is that when someone lives for decades identified only with the persona, the self begins to protest. And it protests with symptoms that most people mistake for problems. What you call a crisis might be the self asking to come through. What you call a nameless existential emptiness might be the self telling you that this way of living can't go on. What you call existential boredom might be the self warning you that the life that's happening isn't yours. Jung was emphatic on this point. The further the persona drifts from the self, the more suffering there is. Not because the person is weak, but because the soul wasn't made to live performing as someone it isn't. There's a classic moment when this tension between the persona and the self explodes with the most force. Jung studied that moment in depth. It happens, in most people, somewhere between 35 and 50 years old. People dismissively call this the midlife crisis, as if it were some silly phase, a whim of someone who has too much time on their hands to think. Jung radically disagreed with that. For him, this isn't a problem, it's a calling, and this calling has a cruel aspect for those who don't understand it. It usually arrives precisely when, on the outside, everything looks in order. The person has reached the goal of owning their home, the job title, the stability, the life they always wanted. And it's exactly at that moment, with everything seemingly accomplished, that the emptiness shows up with the most force. This deeply confuses most people around them. The people closest to them don't get it. Their co-workers even less so. How can you be in crisis if you have everything? But Jung saw it clearly. The person isn't in crisis despite having everything. They're in crisis because everything they have was conquered by the persona, and the self is still looking at that collection of accomplishments, asking one simple and devastating question. And me, where am I in all of this? Think about it. During the first half of life, the person is busy building the persona. They have to study, win a place professionally, build relationships, establish stability. All the psychic energy goes outward. They identify with what they're building, and that's okay. It's part of the process. But there comes a point, usually around the middle of life, where that external mission has fulfilled its role. The house has been built and the job title has been earned, while the life around them keeps changing in increasingly clear ways. And then, naturally, the psyche starts turning inward. It starts asking questions that didn't have any room to be asked before. What if I weren't this anymore? What if I didn't need to prove anything else? Who am I without the obligation? What looks like a breakdown, Jung said, is a calling. The psyche is asking the person to finally live as who they are, and not as the character they built. It isn't a disease, it's a summons, and whoever mistakes that summons for weakness and tries to drown it out with more work, more consumption, more distraction usually ends up paying a much higher price later, because the self doesn't give up. It just gets louder until somebody listens. There's a fairly common scene at this stage of life that's worth describing. The person is driving home on some random late afternoon. The traffic is at a standstill. The radio is playing something, and out of nowhere, with no apparent reason, their eyes fill with tears. It isn't a sadness with a name. It isn't anything they could explain to someone when they get home. It's an old ache, coming from a place they hadn't accessed in years. That ache isn't weakness. It isn't clinical depression. It's the self asking to come through a crack that finally opened. When the person understands that, they stop trying to close the crack. They start trying to understand what's trying to come through it. And here's an important note. Another great thinker of the 20th century, the British psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott, arrived at a conclusion very similar to Jung's, although by a different path. Winnicott noticed, while observing children and adults, that a lot of people developed what he called a false self. The false self was that structure a person formed when they spent their entire life shaping themselves into what others expected them to be. It was a facade that worked perfectly, but behind it, the individual lost contact with what they actually felt, wanted, and were. The result, Winnicott observed, was a feeling that's hard to describe. Functional on the outside and dead on the inside. An impeccable persona carrying, deep down, a self that nobody visited anymore. And whoever is listening to this and recognizes that description has already grasped how big the problem is. You aren't sad out of some whim, and you aren't tired out of weakness, and the emptiness you feel has nothing to do with ingratitude either. You've been living for years a life where the character takes up 100% of the space, and the real person hasn't been given a single minute. Your psyche's reaction is completely understandable. It's asking for help in the only way it knows how. And a little later on, I'm going to reveal to you the only path Jung pointed out as the real way out of this imprisonment, a path he dedicated his whole life to describing. But first, I need to show you the question that holds most people exactly where they are. Now comes the hard question. If recognizing the mask is the first step, why do so few people take that step? Why, even when they identify the problem clearly, do they keep on going, day after day, putting on the persona, reinforcing the persona, feeding the persona, even while feeling that it's destroying them? Jung's answer is uncomfortable, but it's honest. Taking off the mask is scary, a deep, ancient fear that messes with everything that holds up the life you've built. Because the persona isn't alone. It's connected to a whole system. It's connected to your relationship with the person who lives by your side, who has gotten used to a certain version of you. It's connected to the people closest to you, who expect a certain way for you to be. It's connected to your job, which pays for the character you deliver every single day. It's connected to your friends, your parents, your social image, your self-esteem. Taking off the mask, even just a little, means disappointing people. It means breaking invisible agreements that nobody ever formalized, but that everybody signed. It means risking hearing phrases that hurt. You've changed. You're not the same anymore. I don't recognize you. It means facing the discomfort of not knowing, for a while, who you are, after decades of knowing exactly what your role was. Jung knew that this is exactly what holds most people back. That many people deep down prefer the familiar prison of the persona over the unknown discomfort of freedom. And he understood it. It wasn't cowardice. It was human. And you kept going. And maybe that's the quietest part of this whole drama. You know the mask is hurting you, but it's also the only place where you still recognize yourself. Taking it off isn't just losing your protection. It's losing the map. It's being left without direction in a place where for decades you knew exactly where every wall stood. I completely understand when you feel that. It's completely valid to feel that. I'm not saying this to leave you anxious, but to wake you up to something important. The fact that you've made it this far, that you've been willing to face these words, already means something. It means that some part of you, maybe the oldest and most honest part, is willing to look. And just from looking, something shifts. Before we continue with the next step, and it's the most important one of them all, I want to tell you something quickly. If you're enjoying this content, check the first comment for our exclusive ebook, Alchemy and Archetypes. This material was made specifically for those who are starting to realize that there is someone behind the mask and who want to understand in depth the path back to themselves. It's there in the pinned comment, waiting for you. Now, let's get to the most delicate point of this journey. In one of his studies on alchemy and inner transformation, Jung wrote a sentence that should be framed in every therapy office, in every self-knowledge book, in every place where someone is losing themselves. He said that nobody becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Stop on that sentence for a moment. It seems simple, but it's radical. What Jung is saying is that there's no real transformation through superficial positivity. It isn't enough to repeat motivational phrases and believe in pretty thoughts, while denying everything that's considered ugly inside of you. The real path is the opposite. It's looking at the darkness that lives in the basement of your psyche, at the anger held in for years, at the fear of not being enough, at the tenderness you repressed because you thought it was too fragile, at the dream you abandoned because someone told you 30 years ago that it would never work out. That encounter is uncomfortable. It isn't comfortable. It isn't pretty enough for Instagram. It is, often, painful. But Jung said it's the first real act of freedom, because everything you hide from yourself rules you from a distance. And everything you acknowledge loses the power to rule you. You don't become a slave to what you can see. You become a slave to what you pretend isn't there. There's nothing wrong with feeling this right now. It's what happens when someone looks for the first time at things they've spent decades avoiding. Here's an important reflection. Facing the shadow doesn't mean becoming a worse person. It's exactly the opposite. Whoever recognizes their own anger can deal with it without exploding on the people they love. Whoever recognizes their own fear stops being held hostage by it. Whoever recognizes their own vulnerability gains something no armor could ever offer. They gain real intimacy, relationships that don't depend on performance to exist. And finally, the freedom of not needing to prove anything all the time. Jung realized, over decades of clinical practice, that the most whole people he ever met weren't the ones who denied the shadow. They were the ones who had the courage to sit beside it and listen to what it had to say. There's a technical name for this entire process. This path of making conscious what was unconscious, of integrating the persona in the shadow, of bringing the ego closer to the self. Jung called this process individuation. And that, in his view, is the most important task of the second half of life. Individuation isn't about abandoning everything and becoming someone else. It isn't about dropping the life you've built overnight, or becoming some philosophical hermit spitting wisdom. It's something far more subtle and far more powerful. Individuation is no longer confusing the mask with the face. It's continuing to play the roles life asks of you, but without losing yourself in them. It's being a caregiver without becoming nothing more than a function. It's being a professional without letting your job title eat the whole person. It's keeping the persona because it's necessary, but knowing where it ends and where you begin. Maybe the best image for this is this one. Before individuation, the person is an actor who believes they are the character. After individuation, they continue being an actor. They continue being good at the role, but they know the entire time that it's a performance. And when the play is over, when they get home, when the stage goes dark, they can take off the costume. Before, they couldn't. Before, they slept fully dressed, and not even sleep was theirs. There's an important observation about this path that needs to be said clearly. Individuation isn't a destination you arrive at. It isn't a diploma you earn and hang on the wall. It's a continuous movement. A direction you relearn every morning. There are days when you feel close to yourself. There are weeks when you realize, in the middle of some random meeting, that you're performing again. And that's okay. The point isn't to never use the persona again. The point is to never forget again that it is a persona. It's keeping consciousness open. It's coming back to yourself every time you notice you've drifted away. Jung said the human soul works in movements of approach and distance. What matters isn't never drifting away, it's learning the way back. You might be asking yourself something very practical right now. Okay, I get the theory, but how does it start? Where do you begin a process that seems so big and so risky? Jung didn't have a ready-made recipe, and anyone promising a ready-made recipe for this path is lying. But he pointed out directions, and those directions can be translated into very simple, very concrete things that fit into the real life of a modern person. First, start paying attention to the discomfort, to the unease that shows up when you're pretending, to the urge to leave a conversation that means nothing to you, to the specific exhaustion of certain social events. That discomfort is a compass. It points to where the persona is squeezing tightest. It points to the places where you're performing too much. Before changing anything, you have to listen to that compass. Second, start saying no. Not in the big places, but in the small ones where you used to say yes out of pure reflex, in those commitments you accepted just to avoid disappointing anyone. Each genuine no is a crack in the mask. It's the first time in a long time that you're prioritizing the person underneath the persona instead of the other way around. At first, it'll be uncomfortable. People will find it strange. Keep going anyway. Third, allow yourself to feel what you feel without judging it. When the sadness comes, let it come. When the exhaustion shows up, acknowledge it instead of masking it with more caffeine and more meetings. When an unexpected tenderness appears, don't push it down just because it strays from what people expect of you. All of this is information. All of this comes from the self. Fourth, Jung placed enormous value on dreams. He said that dreams were letters the unconscious wrote to the conscious mind. You don't have to become an expert in dream interpretation, but start paying attention to the dreams that seem to be telling you something. Write them down, even if just mentally. Ask yourself what that image is trying to communicate. You're going to be surprised by how much your psyche is talking to you every single night, waiting to be heard. Fifth, set aside silence. Not mandatory meditation. Not a $1,500 spiritual retreat. Just silence. 15 minutes a day where you aren't consuming anything. No phone in your hand and no audio playing in the background to fill the void. Just silence. You'll discover, with a bit of a shock at first, that there's a voice in there that hasn't been given any space to speak in a long time. That voice belongs to the person behind the mask. When you give it silence, it shows up. There's also a sixth movement, maybe the most underestimated of all. Learning to tell the truth to one single person. Not to the world, not to social media, not to a large group at some expensive workshop. Just one person you trust. It can be a longtime friend, a therapist, someone you know won't use your honesty against you. And, with that person, start practicing saying what you really feel, without softening it, without translating it into the language of the persona. Jung observed that the soul needs witnesses, that there are things inside us that can only become real when they're spoken out loud to another human being. As long as the truth stays locked inside your head, it remains shadow. Once it's spoken, even to just one person, it begins to become part of you. Taking off the mask isn't a demolition, it's a reclamation. It's a gradual process, often invisible to anyone on the outside. One layer today, another in 3 months, another next year. And at some point you realize you've changed, that you're calmer, that you're more whole, that you're basically doing the same things, but in a completely different way, that you're no longer losing yourself, that you finally learned to use the mask instead of being used by it. And here's something interesting. As that process unfolds, something curious starts to shift around you too. The people who really love you tend to come closer again. The relationships that were sustained only by the performance might crack, and that rupture, although painful, usually turns out to be a liberation for both sides. Conversations turn into something else. The way the people closest to you look at you reaches you differently, because now there's someone behind that look to be reached. The very intimacy with the person you live with changes, because, maybe for the first time in a long time, it's the real you that this person is actually talking to. There's something you might not have noticed up to this point, but that needs to be said. The restlessness that brought you to this text, that unease that has you looking for content like this, that exhaustion of living on autopilot, all of this is already part of the process. It isn't weakness. It isn't a problem. It's lucidity emerging. For Jung, these symptoms meant exactly one thing. The self is waking up. The mask is cracking. And that's good news. Maybe the best news you could receive at this moment in your life. Because whoever never feels bothered by the persona, whoever never questions the character, whoever never feels that dull emptiness on a Sunday afternoon, those are the people, according to Jung, who run the greatest risk. The risk of getting to 70 or 80 years old, with a life fulfilled in every role, and never having found the person underneath. Jung said that's the silent tragedy of modern life. It isn't failing in front of others. It's getting to the end and discovering that you never found yourself. The person who exists behind the persona didn't die. They were muffled, postponed, pushed to the background for so long that it often feels like they vanished. But they're still there. Every time you get emotional about something you didn't expect to get emotional about. Every time an old song takes you to a place no word could ever reach. Every time you look at someone you love and feel that there's something inside you far greater than anything you did at work today. That something is you. It's the self. And when, some time from now, you look at yourself again in the mirror, in that silent moment after another long day, maybe you'll notice something new. The face is still yours, but now there's someone behind it. Someone you recognize. Someone who waited a long time for this encounter, and who has, finally, come back home.